Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for this very timely edition of our Pennsylvania Policy Center State Policy Action Call. For those of you who may be new to these calls, my name is Felicity Williams, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Policy Center. We are a statewide, nonpartisan public policy research organization focused on helping Pennsylvanians better understand how policy decisions impact everyday life across our Commonwealth. Our work is grounded in the belief that policy should work for all Pennsylvanians, not just the wealthy and well-connected, and that people deserve clear information, strong analysis, and meaningful opportunities to take action together. Before we begin, I want to go over a few quick housekeeping items. All attendee microphones are muted to help minimize background noise and make sure everyone can clearly hear today's speakers. However, we absolutely want this to be an interactive conversation. Throughout the program, please feel free to drop your questions into the Zoom chat. We'll be collecting questions during the discussion, and we'll move into a Q&A portion later in the program where we'll pose as many questions as time allows. If you experience any technical issues during the call, please send a message in the chat to our team, and we'll do our best to assist you. And I love seeing all of the hellos from all over the Commonwealth. Thank you, guys. Now I want to spend a few minutes grounding us in why we felt it was important to hold today's conversation and why this topic matters so deeply for Pennsylvanians. Today's discussion is titled, "What is Trump's Iran War Really Costing Pennsylvania Families?" And before we talk about economics, budgets, or rising costs, I want to acknowledge something important. War carries devastating human consequences. Lives are lost, families are torn apart, communities are destabilized, and innocent people often bear the greatest burden. That includes innocent Iranian civilians caught in the violence, as well as American soldiers and military families who are placed in harm's way. Those costs should never be treated lightly or reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet. In addition to those devastating human consequences, we also have a responsibility to examine the broader impacts of war, including the economic consequences that ripple outward into communities here at home. Because for working families in Pennsylvania, these impacts are not abstract. They show up at the gas pump, they show up in grocery bills, they show up in rising transportation and shipping costs, they show up in higher costs for farmers and producers. And they show up in growing pressure on already strained household budgets at a time when many Pennsylvanians are struggling with affordability. Families across the country were already dealing with rising costs for basics like groceries, healthcare, and prescription drugs before this conflict escalated. Wages and public supports have not kept pace with the real cost of living for many working people. Now, additional economic shocks tied to this war are creating even more pressure. We've already seen major disruptions connected to instability in the Strait of Hormuz, a critical global shipping route for oil and energy supplies. Analysts and economists have warned that these disruptions are contributing to rising fuel prices and broader inflationary pressure, which you'll hear more specifics about shortly. Recent reporting has linked the conflict to spikes in gas prices, shipping costs, and supply chain disruptions affecting consumers globally. And here in Pennsylvania, those impacts matter enormously. We are a state where many people rely on driving to work. We are a major logistics and transportation corridor. We have significant agricultural communities already dealing with rising fertilizer and transportation costs. When fuel prices rise sharply, those costs ripple across the economy very quickly. We're already seeing concerns about rising gas prices and broader affordability impacts connected to the conflict. We're seeing growing concern about increased costs for fertilizer, shipping, and food production that could place even more pressure on Pennsylvania households in the months ahead. And beyond those direct household impacts, there's also the broader question of public priorities. At a moment when Pennsylvania is already facing serious budget pressures and difficult conversations about funding schools, transit, healthcare, infrastructure, and other essential services, we have to ask difficult questions about what happens when billions more federal dollars are directed toward war instead of investments that actually improve people's lives here at home. That is part of why this conversation connects so directly to the work we do at the Pennsylvania Policy Center and through campaigns like For Our Commonwealth. At PPC, we spend a great deal of time talking about how economic systems and public policy choices shape affordability, inequality, and quality of life in Pennsylvania. We talk about the consequences of chronic underinvestment in public goods and what happens when working families are asked to carry heavier and heavier burdens while wealth at the top continues to grow. Today's conversation is part of that broader discussion because economic pain does not happen in isolation. Federal decisions can create enormous downstream consequences for states, local communities, and households. And when those costs are shifted downward, working people and everyday folks often end up paying the price. That's why education, accountability, and public engagement matters so much in moments like this. So today, we are grateful to be joined by two incredible speakers who will help us understand these issues. First, we'll hear from Maura Quint, who also happens to be a Pennsylvania resident and the Deputy Director of Families Over Billionaires, an organization that has been helping elevate conversations nationally about economic inequality, public priorities, and who our economy is really working for. And we'll also hear from our very own Laura Beltrán Figueroa, Director of Policy Research and Legislative Strategy here at the Pennsylvania Policy Center. Thank you all again for being here with us this afternoon. We appreciate your time, your engagement, and your willingness to stay informed and involved during such an important moment. And with that, let's get started. We'll hand it over to you, Maura.
Thanks. Sorry, I was trying to find the unmute button with everything going on, but thank you so much for having me on here. I am Maura Quint with Families Over Billionaires. For those of you who may be new to Families Over Billionaires, we are a national organization. We work in tax justice and economic fairness to create a country where families can meet their needs and get ahead, instead of a country where billionaires use our tax system like their own personal piggy bank, which is, of course, how it's been set up for some time now. So we're here to talk about how we are spending money and how we as a country are budgeting our money. And budgets are moral documents. What we fund tells us who we are and who we prioritize and who we care about. And what we've seen from Trump and the Republicans is that who they care about are the billionaires. They care about the profits of the wealthiest. They do not care about the rest of us. So I know we're here to talk about the Iran war, but I wanted to share that from the way we see it, Trump, who we know has been going on and on about how he's an anti-war president, has actually been waging not one, but three very distinct wars. The first is the Iran war. The Iran war is extremely expensive. It's destabilizing. It's brutal. And it is, of course, driving up costs for all of us while having no clearly stated goals or moral purpose. The purpose seems to be to create destruction and harm. And while we're looking at domestic spending right now, we are expecting that Trump and the Republicans are going to be asking for additional funding for the Iran war sometime in the near future. So let's start with what they have. The Pentagon right now has more than enough. The Pentagon's budget approaches $1 trillion, and it received an additional $150 billion last year from I'm going to call it the OBA, because I don't like saying the one big beautiful bill, but you might know it as that. It received $150 billion. There's absolutely no justification for diverting more from our essential domestic programs to fund this conflict. Right now, it is costing $1 billion a day. So the $1 billion a day that is being spent on the war in Iran, let's just talk about some of the other things that we could be spending it on. With that money, we could more than triple the daily funding for food assistance. With that money, we could fully cover the daily cost of permanently extending the ACA tax credits and restoring those devastating Medicaid cuts that happened in OBA that threaten care for millions of people across the country. We could use that money to replace at least 200,000 lead pipes that are currently in the U.S. drinking water supply. Or we could finance construction subsidies for tens of thousands of affordable housing units. There are so many domestic priorities that could be met if we were not already paying for war. But Iran isn't even the only war that Trump and his colleagues are funding. They are also funding a war directly on the people of this country. So as you may have heard, if you are a budget and econ wonk, or you read way too many headlines, as certainly I do, we are currently heading into a second reconciliation fight. We had a reconciliation fight last year, 2025, that summer, and now we are starting the second reconciliation fight. Republicans thus far are using this reconciliation fight to try to push for additional funding to ICE and CBP. So let's look at the funding that they already have. So in July of last year, of 2025, Congress enacted H.R. 1, which gave the Department of Homeland Security $170 billion to carry out what they call immigration enforcement, but detention and deportation over the span of 4 years. The DHS is using that money right now with no agency accountability, and it's claiming it has no guardrails. H.R. 1 last year made the DHS richer than most of the world's militaries. H.R. 1 gave ICE $75 billion. That's more than 7 times ICE's annual appropriated budget and more than all other federal law enforcement agencies combined. That money from last year, that $75 billion, that could have paid for 1 year of SNAP benefits for 1.4 million people in this country. It could have paid for 250,000 people to receive Medicaid for a year. It could have financed 4 years of university for over 45,000 students. We could be using that money to make people in our country safer, healthier, well-educated. And instead, we are using it to fund terror in our communities. We're using it to separate families, and we're using it to fund a nearly unaccountable militarized force that is harming our neighbors. The Trump administration has funded the war abroad, it's funding the war here, and it's also funding a third war, and that is a war on our safety net. The safety net is what we all pay into, and yet the Trump administration has given massive, massive cuts to things like healthcare and food assistance and other agencies that we need and rely on in order to pay for a $4.5 trillion in tax cuts to billionaires and corporations, all under that OBA bill. In the 16 months, it has only been 16 months. I know it feels like a lot longer, but in the 16 months since Trump has been reelected, the collective fortune of Pennsylvania, just Pennsylvania alone, Pennsylvania's 23 billionaires has grown by $32.6 billion. We know who is benefiting from the policies that Trump and the Republican administration is putting into place. So we're April 23rd. So we are 1 week out from tax day. Tax day was last week, last Wednesday. I know I saw a lot of you at activities in Harrisburg at the Capitol building. Paying your taxes is not fun. I know, I hated doing it, but I did it. And I'm going to assume every single person on this call listening paid your taxes. But this year, I think we're all a bit angry, and very rightfully so. As Felicity said, I live in Pennsylvania. I'm in Harrisburg area. And I know that all of us as Pennsylvanians work very hard. We play by the rules, we pay what we owe, and every year we're getting less and less back. Costs are up. Groceries, rent, gas, childcare, and the services that we pay into, that our taxes fund, are being stripped away in order to fund these other priorities, these devastating priorities. Billionaires and big corporations are posting record profits still. They are not struggling. And they are passing on additional costs from the tariffs and from other costs that they're receiving on to consumers. They're holding our wages flat, and they're using loopholes and accounting tricks to pay a lower effective tax rate than a teacher living in Pennsylvania. And that's not a talking point. That is the law as it is written. It does not have to be this way, though. Budgets are moral documents. We can change ours. If the wealthiest individuals and the biggest corporations paid their fair share, just like the rest of us in Pennsylvania already do, we could lower everyday costs for families. We could invest in schools and healthcare and childcare that people actually need. And we can build an economy where hard work really means something. And this isn't some crazy fringe idea. This is a very popular idea. We've done a lot of polling. We've seen a lot of polling. Voters across party lines all agree. Billionaires and large corporations should be paying more in taxes. The only ones who do not seem to agree with this are the current administrators, the current Republicans, Trump and the people in his cabinet who are absolutely continuing to prioritize cutting taxes for the wealthiest. But we can change that. We do have a voice. We do have power together. We can make sure that the people representing us are representing our interests and not the interests of massive corporations and billionaires. I know here in Pennsylvania, we have primaries coming up, and of course, then we have elections in the fall. This is a place where we can start to get involved. We can talk to one another. We can talk to candidates. We can make sure that they stand where we stand on prioritizing the needs of everyday Pennsylvanians. We can demand that our representatives fight for a fair tax code. Because when we get that right, we are not just fixing the tax code. We're building a country where families can once again get ahead and where the promise of the American dream is not a lie, it is a true promise. And so thank you all so much for inviting me and Families Over Billionaires to be out here today. It is really inspiring to see all of the work that Pennsylvania and the PA Policy Group is doing as well. So appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Maura. And with that, we'll hand it over to you, Laura.
Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Share. Okay, can everyone see it? Perfect. Maura, thank you so much for those remarks. I think they really highlight the reality that's going on with the current administration fighting three wars, and one of them is basically on us, and then the other one is on thousands of children and families all over the globe. So I just wanted to start by highlighting that. Getting a little bit on to the statistics and the numbers and the timeline for this war. So as you might have heard, the war officially started February 27th when the Trump administration approved military action. Then we saw on February 28th the war officially beginning with U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran. Throughout the month of March, we saw the fighting expand and economic fallout, including the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, which is one of the main waterways through which international trade occurs, mostly through oil and fertilizers. We had April 7th, a temporary ceasefire announced, and April 17th, Hormuz reopening. Although it's been a partial reopening as of now, we have that the volume of vessels entering the area is still very low compared to what we regularly get. And then I updated this on April 20th, but it's April 23rd. Not much has changed. Every day we hear the truce remains shaky, and now there are a lot more players, including Israel, going into the conflict with their agreement with Lebanon and holding also a co-ceasefire while Iran and the US are holding theirs. So Okay, so this is happening not in an alienated event. It's also happening while Pennsylvania families and families across the United States and probably around the world are facing an affordability crisis. We see groceries roughly 20% up in the last year, utilities up 26%, car insurance 56%, medical and dental visits roughly 13%, and our wages and salaries have not increased by any of these measures. So what this means is we're having an additional burden placed on us as this war is raging and as the total human toll is increasing. We have that for many workers, they're either having their paychecks not growing, and if you're also a data wonk like I am, you're going to see that the labor market in general is plateauing. We are not seeing the expected growth. So when families are already stretched thin, budget cuts or underfunded public services, which is also what we're facing, make the pressure even worse. So getting a little bit into the numbers of the war, and these numbers are non-official, but it's estimates we're receiving from different sources, including Reuters. So we have that in the first 6 days of the war, it costed roughly 11.3 billion, and now I think we've stabilized probably to 1 billion per day, as Maura mentioned in her remarks. But in the beginning, it was closer to two. The munitions cost was just in the first 2 days was just 5.6 billion, and we already have roughly 50,000 troops in the region. As Maura also mentioned, we have that Congress was told to expect requests for tens of billions more. Some of the discussions have reportedly reached more than 200 billion, and within the cost of previous wars, this is roughly what we would be expecting. So what this means for Pennsylvania. So as you're aware, the taxes we collect, a significant portion go to the federal government. So that means that out of our 13.1 million residents, we represent roughly 3.8 of the country. So if we were to take all of these big numbers, the 11.3 billion, 5.6 billion, and 50,000, and calculate the 3.8%, which is roughly our share, we would say that the share of the first 11.3 billion is roughly 434.5 million, roughly, that Pennsylvanians are contributing or contributed during the first 6 days of the war. We have that the share of that munitions cost, which was roughly 5.5 billion, is 215.3 billion out of the taxpayer pockets in Pennsylvania. And we can say, and this is probably a higher number because Pennsylvania generally has a higher rate of troops than other states, but we can say that roughly 1,923, close to 2,000 individuals are already in the region, potentially from Pennsylvania. So if the 200 billion request moved forward and got approved, then Pennsylvania's share would be close to 7.7 billion. And because we're the Pennsylvania Policy Center, I also want to highlight that number gets really close to what our structural deficit is. So basically doubling it. So this will already be a very large hit for a state that's facing major affordability and budget pressures, as we've highlighted in other of our presentations. So the impacts don't stop at what we contribute in our dollars. It also shows up in our daily lives. So if you drive around the state, you might have seen gas prices increasing rapidly as the war developed. So the average gas increase from the start of the war to April 6th was $3.12 to $4.15, which is roughly a 33% increase. We have that one of the reasons why this happened is because as the Strait of Hormuz closed, global oil prices increased roughly about 5%. And we also have that the closing also led, and even throughout the temporary reopening of it, we see that we have only seen 3 ships in the 12 hours on April 20th versus roughly the 130 vessel crossings that happened under normal circumstances. So if we can do the math there, it's definitely more than an 80 to 90% reduction in what we're usually used to seeing move through that area. So I'm sure I don't need to mention this, but high gas prices affects us all, affects commuters, delivery costs, and family budgets fast. And in a state where it's a very expansive state, many people drive to work, and goods to move long distances, a war-driven oil shock gets felt quickly. And beyond this, we also have another constraint aside from the gas. We also have that fertilizer was moved through this route pretty often. So nitrogen fertilizer actually increased in price roughly by not 30%, but close enough. But what we have is that 30% of the nitrogen fertilizer exports that go through were caught in Iran's near-term closure of Hormuz. And even as we've seen some reopening of it, the nitrogen fertilizer movement is still limited. We also have another common fertilizer, which rose roughly 17% per ton compared to the war. And we also have broadly freight rates and war risk insurance also spiking in the area, making it more difficult for corporations and different business to actually get their goods through their goods through this region. So As of now, we have seen impacts at the pump, in fertilizer bills, in shipping charges, and eventually in grocery prices. And in shipping charges, we've actually seen a lot of the major mail deliveries announce price increases, and the couple, I believe some of them are beginning in January 2027. Some of them are hitting closer, but we're already seeing that shipping is getting expensive locally. And then some early warning signs. So what we see is that while it's very hard to measure the increase directly of what food price increases are attributed to the war, we can say the International Food Price Index rose 2.4% in March, with wheat, vegetable oils, sugar, and meat all moving higher. We also have the FAO mentioning and warning that if fertilizers, as shown in the previous slide, were to continue being at this price, farmers would have to cut inputs or plant less, further putting a strain on our food supply, which is generally in a decreasing trend, potentially contributing to higher food prices. And then, particularly for the US, we see that the USDA forecasts that US food at home will rise 3.1% in 2026, above inflation. And what does this mean? So I've given you a lot of facts and a lot of data points, but the main point I want to get across is this war is already costly. It has costed us as the taxpayers, but it's also costing us in our daily lives. And this price, we're doing calculations with 11 billion. If it were to reach 200 billion, the price we pay would grow dramatically. Even if Pennsylvania's estimated share of the cost is only at the 3.8%, because that's how much we represent population-wise, this is billions of dollars tied to a conflict that's not doing anything for Pennsylvania families. And beyond the military price tag and the higher gas prices and the higher farm inputs and the added pressure on household budgets, this is also an issue that's affecting thousands of individuals. We are seeing displacement from a lot of regions in the Middle East because of this conflict and because of the associated conflicts that are going in that area. But also locally, we just see that families' budgets are already stretched thin. We're still reeling with the effects of the OBB. And if shameless plug, PPC also has a lot of resources on that. But more war means more spending, which ultimately means fewer resources for Pennsylvanians and just for the rest of the US and what we truly need in terms of social supports. And I think that's it from me. Jeff, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Laura. And thank you to Maura as well. It's really great to get this combination of a perspective from kind of the national level and then looking really closely down into the weeds here in Pennsylvania. One of the things that we appreciate so much here at Pennsylvania Policy Center is what a great ally and resource Maura and her colleagues at Families Over Billionaire consistently are. As you heard, they were involved last week with some efforts we were doing outside the state capitol, focusing on tax day and the need for tax fairness. So I've dropped in the chat there some information. I want to encourage folks to sign up to stay informed about some important developments, updates, reports that our friends at Families Over Billionaires will be putting out over the next few days. Next few months, looking at the cost of the war as it continues. Wish the war would be over in a few days, but sadly, it looks like it will probably be a bit longer. I'm looking at the questions here in the chat, and we've been encouraging folks to drop them in the chat, and we're going to get to as many of these as we can. I'm going to start off with some questions here from our friend Anju. There's actually several parts to this question, so maybe we'll take these one by one. One of the questions is, if most people support equitable tax systems and Democrats support it too, has the House passed a bill recently to address this?
Well, I can jump in a little bit here. I mean, the House has not passed a bill to address it specifically because Republicans currently control the House. So that is a major obstacle. But it is true that the majority of people across party lines do support higher taxation on billionaires and massive corporations. I will share, I mean, several Dems have introduced various bills. And in fact, one was introduced just last week on tax day. And this was Senator Chris Van Hollen and Representative Don Beyer. They introduced the Millionaires Surtax Act. That's a lot of vowels. But it would apply an additional 10%, a 10% point tax to incomes above 2 million for married couples or above 1 million for individuals. And it would apply equally to wages and salaries as well as to capital gains and other investment income, which is, of course, how the majority of the wealthiest make their income and continue to grow their wealth. So the Millionaire Surtax Act, if it were to be passed, if it were to be brought to a vote and passed, would raise 1.5 trillion over 10 years. And they are showing that 70% of voters in their polling want to see higher taxes on the rich, which is about what we continually see and have seen for several years now. This isn't necessarily a new thing. However, it is something that continues to strengthen. Every time we poll it, it goes up just a little bit. More and more people are recognizing that this is a major problem and this unfairness cannot continue to go on. So there are some Dems who are looking to some solutions, but right now in the Republican-controlled House and Senate, there is no likelihood that these would be brought to any sort of vote.
Thanks for addressing that, Maura. Couple related questions here from Anju. What are the Republicans using as an argument to continue this upside-down tax system? Is it large corporations paying, donating to our elected officials' campaigns? Can we call them out by name for taking money from these PACs?
I would certainly say you're very much welcome to. I think it is a very important thing, and everyone should do whatever they are called to do on these. But I do think that we should make sure that we are demanding of our electeds that they are representing us. And in terms of what arguments Republicans are using, they're not. They're not. They're using other issues. They're trying to focus their electorate on other things and using those issues to drive their electorate to the polls. They are not, I mean, they occasionally try to throw out things. Some Republicans even are saying, hey, this system is unfair. There is a strain of a Republican who at least claims economic populism, but then does not fight for those policies once they hold office. So even Republicans, I think, more and more are seeing that the electorate knows this, and they may try to give lip service to it, but they are certainly not engaging in any actions that would follow those or that would back up any commitment to really do this.
Thanks for sharing the sad but true news with us, Maura, and thanks for these questions. We're going to go to some more questions we've got from our friend Noni in southeastern Pennsylvania. Do we have a handle on the increase in our national debt? I have seen we are at a rounded number of $39 trillion, and it's increasing $7 to $9 billion a day. What are the implications of this for us?
I can take this one. So the main implication with a rising debt is the interest that you have to pay on it. So just as a credit card works, if you keep adding and adding and adding to that credit card, your interest is going to increase, or the portion of your money that goes to your interest is going to increase, as well as your payment. So just to put into a number, we have that the Treasury fiscal data actually shows that the interest expense is currently at 623 billion, and that's just year to date. So every year we're spending somewhere between 600 and 800, maybe even close to 1 trillion, depending on Treasury prices, on paying interest on the debt we're accumulating. And that interest payment comes from our taxes. So if we didn't have such a massive deficit, we would not be spending somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion in interest.
Thanks so much, Laura. And really appreciate you having this kind of information so quickly at your fingertips. It's great to work with colleagues who are so attuned to the facts of what's going on around us. Going to a few more questions here. Looking now, we have one at the state level. And you had noted earlier, Maura, that coming up next month, we actually have primary elections here in Pennsylvania. And I think as most people are aware, we have some pretty significant midterm elections coming up this fall. And so we have members of our General Assembly who are retiring this year, not running for reelection. We have some who will probably run for reelection and be defeated, and we'll have other folks who are first-time candidates who are stepping into some of those seats next year. So as we look toward the elections and beyond the elections to next year, at the state level, what can our legislators and people who would like to be our legislators do in the General Assembly to advocate for tax fairness and to hold officials accountable for the kind of actions that Trump's taken? Can I open that up to any of our panelists, or Felicity as well? You're welcome to chime in.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you for this question. So there are a couple different ways in which you can get involved. First and foremost, it is so important to get educated and informed on these issues. And that is a lot of what organizations like Pennsylvania Policy Center are doing, because we know that we need you to be armed with the facts. And so we have a Budget Resources Hub website that we have been continuing to update and provide policy analysis and briefs. Laura and I have been working on those together to help make sure that people understand not only just what the numbers are, but the impact behind those numbers. So that's first and foremost. We need to get educated and informed. The second is getting engaged with our For Our Commonwealth campaign. And so we have on the call here today with us, even though he's not speaking, but you guys have seen him dropping things in the chat, our campaign director, Dwayne. So please, if you click the link that he provided in the chat, you can sign up to join that campaign as either an individual change maker. If you are a current legislator, you can sign on as a legislator, or you can also sign on as an organization. And we have been working on ways to pull in those folks into future campaign strategy conversations and meetings so that we can work together. So please feel free to do that. And then lastly, once or if someone becomes a legislator, it is so important to make sure that you are doing that engagement with your colleagues, that you are really building those relationships so that you can help be one of those connectors and voices of the people. So as we know, the polling shows that around 76% of Pennsylvanians agree that we should be taxing multimillionaires, billionaires, and multinational corporations more. So again, the people are with us. It's just time for some of our legislators to catch up. And any legislators, current or future legislators, can be part of that process for change and be an advocate for change. So just a couple ways that you can get involved and hold folks accountable.
Yeah, if I can just add on to that, Felicity,
Yeah,
as well, because
please.
obviously, I mean, everything you all do is so fantastic, and I would definitely encourage everyone to get involved. I also just want to share that, these numbers and these polling numbers that we're talking about in terms of this being really popular, are things that you can explore as well when you talk to other people. And it is something I think that's really important to keep in mind, because all of us have friends and family and neighbors. And I know that we don't all necessarily have the people around us who we think are maybe politically fully aligned. This is a great topic of conversation that you can have, even with the people that you feel maybe don't line up exactly where you are in a lot of other issues. This is one that people really do respond well to. They hear and understand that when Amazon is paying no taxes, but we as Pennsylvanians are paying taxes, we're funding Amazon's ability to move trucks from place to place. We are funding their business model. That's something that shouldn't be the case. And it is a really, really great way to start engaging with people directly. And I will also say that when you are speaking to representatives, or when you're speaking to colleagues, if you work within the state house, sharing stories is absolutely one of the best ways to communicate this, because a lot of times we hear the numbers, we hear the data, and it's hard to take in. But when you hear stories about how it is impacting people you know directly, when you hear about families who cannot afford to take care of their children, who cannot afford food, who are struggling with medical bills, then you have a real place to start. And people are moved by that. They respond to that a lot better. So I would just encourage people to speak to one another, which is tough, but is really, really effective. And I think sometimes we feel like it's not enough, and it really does matter and make a difference.
Thank you so much for that helpful perspective, Maura, and for that encouragement. We've kind of gotten to the end of our questions here from folks in the chat. And I think you kind of gave a good summary statement there at the end, Maura, kind of wrapping things up. Laura and Felicity, I want to open up to you. If either of you have any closing comments that you'd like to make before we close out the meeting, that would be wonderful.
Thank you, Jeff. I just want to thank all of you all again for showing up consistently, time and time again, to our policy action calls and for your engagement, your questions. I want to uplift something that Maura said, is that we have to consistently not just be preaching to the choir, we have to consistently grow the congregation, right? That's my phrasing for it. And so we need each and every one of you. You have tremendous power. Power is with the people, to talk to your family members, your friends, your neighbors, folks that you worship with, etc., anyone in your network about these issues, to help make sure that they are engaged and informed. You can always connect with Pennsylvania Policy Center. We love bringing in new people to this work, and we also love connecting you to some of our great partners, our national partners like Families Over Billionaires. We shared some resources here from them in the chat as well. And so we look forward to you all continuing to be engaged, and that we will continue to bring these timely topics to you guys, so that we are really breaking down for you what is happening in Pennsylvania, how the federal government is impacting things happening in Pennsylvania, so you have the information to go out and get engaged. Thank you all for your time today.
Thank you so much, Felicity. Thank you, Laura and Maura, for all of the really helpful information. Thank you to all of you for joining us here, for taking the time to think about how policy issues impact us, not just here in Pennsylvania, but across the country and around the world. Please support the For Our Commonwealth campaign. I dropped some information in there. That's how we're going to make sure that the ultra-rich in Pennsylvania are paying their fair share, while our friends at Families Over Billionaires are fighting the good fight to make sure at the federal level that they are taxing billionaires and corporations at a fair and effective rate. Our next policy action meeting will be coming up on the first Thursday in May. That is Thursday, May 7th. Thursday, May 7th. We'll have more information coming out in the weeks ahead. From today's meeting, you can expect an email probably tomorrow with a link to the recording of this. If there's any part that you missed or you want to share it with others, you can do that. We will also include the slides from the PowerPoint presentation that Laura shared, and some other materials that we shared today as well. On that note, thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.